I'm not sure where to really start our time together, but with this admission to you that I'm attempting to make some adjustment in how I do what I do. I realized in recent weeks, as I've had opportunity to speak to groups of people, how mechanical this process when I'm just addressing a camera actually becomes, and I don't want that. And I'm afraid that carries over when I actually do get a chance to speak to a group of people. So indulge me as we continue to share this journey, and I'm going to try to dial down maybe the formality. That's the reason the setting is changed. We may go back to the office chair on occasion, but I want to try to do something different because I want a greater sense of freedom in doing what I'm doing. I have an opportunity this coming Monday night to speak to a group of women from various churches just south of here, a prayer gathering, and I'm looking forward very much to doing that, sort of outside of my normal comfort zone. But I want to feel that sense of liberty when I'm speaking there or actually when I'm speaking here. And so if the change is for better or worse, and I trust that some of you will communicate that to me, I just want to make this as positive an experience as I can for everyone. And then I'm not really sure what the next couple of weeks are going to hold for me. I go next week to begin the process of cataract surgery, first this eye, and then the following week this eye. And so my vision is going to be a little out of kilter, and I'm not sure what that's going to look like. So just indulge me as we work through this process. I'll attempt to post something even if we're not able to shoot a new video. All that being said, I know one of the things that I think I struggle with that maybe most believers do not struggle with, and that is that clearly defined sense of purpose on a daily basis and a weekly basis and a monthly basis. I know it's easy to assume on the part of anyone when I talk about being, quote, retired, they assume that I'm ready for a fishing pole or a rocking chair or a golf cart or something else where I don't have a real driving agenda in my life. Now, I know that that's true for some preachers that I've heard about. It just doesn't happen to be for me. I still have to have a divine purpose to motivate me to get up every day and to have something to look forward to. I've created some problems for myself in the meantime, and that is I have some unfinished projects sitting out in my garage that are simply waiting my attention. And I have not felt comfortable setting aside my drive to create opportunities for ministry in order to get back to those. So pray for me about that. I want to get those done, but I don't want it to interfere with what I'm doing here. And I know from the outside, when people are looking at highly committed believers, at times it's hard to distinguish when they're actually operating on a given agenda or when they're just simply sort of waiting on the leading of the Spirit moment by moment. And as I was reading the material for this week, chapter 7 of Acts chapter 27, I couldn't help but think that that's sort of where we are. We have this sort of narrative passage, and it's really at a sort of odd place where it begins and where it concludes, because it's not a clean-cut section, but it's the material we're going to try to cover in the time we have, which means that the next time we come around, we're going to be in the last chapter of the book of Acts. And not sure how many days that's going to take to work through that. But having said that, to sort of frame this, that we're entitling what spiritual winging it looks like, and most of you understand what that means. I saw a piece, I think it was on TCM, they were doing a segment on Clint Eastwood. Now, this is the Clint Eastwood that most of us grew up and recognized and loved. The man with no name. You can understand, I sort of felt like I had an affinity with him, whether he was the nameless cowboy or whether he was the go ahead, make my day character. You know, now he's 90 or 91 years old, and he is nowhere close to retiring. He's been called the actor's director because he continues to do both. And the interview segment about him and what he did, we're not going to go into all of it, but there was something that he said about his directing that accounts for why the movies he makes are so well done. And that is that he doesn't have he doesn't have a formal starting or finishing. He doesn't say action when it's time to roll the film, or roll. He doesn't say that. And when it's time for a scene to stop, he doesn't say cut. He'll just say something like, okay, that's good, that's good. And in the interview, he told the interviewer, he said, now I have told my camera people, when I say that's good enough or okay, he said, I've told them don't stop the camera. Because he said quite often at those times we get the best takes on what is going on when people assume that the camera is not rolling. What spiritual winging it looks like. When we're tracking with Paul through his journey, you could see when he was task driven. He knew where he wanted to go and he knew what he wanted to do, and he sort of had an idea of what he was going to do when he got there. But now that he's been arrested and he's in the hands of the authorities and he's been kicked around a good bit in chapters 23 through 26. And so finally chapter 27, he's been being put on board a ship to be sent to what? To Rome. This is the kind of ship, in all probability, that he was put on board of to begin with. Probably a single square-sailed ship. And he was to change ships in the middle of the journey. And then here's a map of the best guess of what that final trip was like on board a couple of ships. It actually would be 3 ships. And when you step back and you look at this, you go, well, what do we do with that? You don't have a commission going on here. You don't have a church to be planted. You don't have people to be discipled. You don't have all the normal things that have sort of driven Paul in this journey. So what is it we do with that? And I thought, this is one of those occasions in a believer's life when what unfolds and what happens, what is said and what is done, has all the appearances of the apostle just winging it. And so for that reason, that's how we're going to look at this. Because I feel somewhat sort of a kinship with that right now. We have this ministry that many of you are supporting, and I'm grateful for that. We continue to build relationships and have conversations, and I'm shooting video footage of interviews that are yet to be posted. I'm doing the weekly ministry here. I'm working with a couple of churches to help find partnering churches for them to come alongside of and help. But most of the time, I'm left to my own devices, what I do when I get up on a Monday or a Tuesday or Wednesday or whatever it happens to be, unless I have a specific task I'm going to be preaching on given Sunday. So indulge me as we walk through this passage and try to, again, I want to try to be a little bit more informal in this journey. So please pray for me in this process and give me some feedback. So the first thing of what spiritual winging it looks like, it actually looks like an acceptance or sort of an acquiescence in verses 1 through 11. So follow with me as we read this passage, beginning in verse 1. When it was decided that we should sail to Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were transferred to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the emperor's division. Now you notice he said, when it was decided, Paul was not a part of the decision-making process. And he's called Paul and some other prisoners. And so they were under somebody else's supervision. Verse 2, after boarding a ship from Andromeda that was about to sail to the ports on the coast of Asia, we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, went with us. The next day we arrived at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly, allowing him to visit his friends there and to receive any care that he needed. After putting out from there, we sailed on the sheltered side of Cyprus because the winds were against us. We sailed along the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia and reached Myra at Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy and put us on it. It was a grain ship, and the smallest of the grain ships in those days was about 75 tons of grain that they would carry. So depending on the size of the ship and the load as to whether it was a single mast with one square sail or a double mast. We don't have that information. We just know it was big enough to carry that tonnage. We sailed slowly for a number of days, and with difficulty arriving at Cnidus. Then, because the winds were against us, we sailed on the sheltered side of Crete off Cape Salome. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. What does spiritual winging it look like? It looks like simply going with the circumstantial flow. Paul is a prisoner. He's not making any decisions in terms of this, and so he simply goes as a compliant prisoner. And so sometimes it just looks like an acceptance of the circumstances. When they leave their first port, they go up the coast, the Mediterranean Sea there, and they go into a place, and the centurion that he's responsible to lets him meet with friends, believers, and they have a time of fellowship, and then he gets back on the ship and they continue their journey around and across the Mediterranean Sea. And he simply recounts the things that happen, and he's just simply, you might say, one more prisoner and one more passenger on board a ship that he has not booked his passage, he is not paying for his passage. He is under the control of someone else who is under the control of somebody else who's under the control of somebody else. And so in that moment, rather than make issue or take issue or try to create something in that moment, Paul, in effect, just goes with the flow. And so there are times, and it doesn't. We don't have a lot of detail. We know that the winds were contrary, and they did this on board the ship, and there's really no commentary about what Paul is doing other than he's just there with the rest of them. I'm pretty sure on board those ships they had a crew, but under dire circumstances, everybody was subject to being drafted as a crew. And so I want to think that for much of the time for a dedicated believer, while we have a commission to preach the gospel, we have a commission to disciple those who are responding, we have a commission to plant and to water and to pray for the increase of the harvest, we have a commission to walk in holiness and to be like Jesus, and to seek every opportunity to be a reflection of Him and influence the world that we're in. More times than not, there is not a specific assignment that many of us will have in the moment. When you're in the trenches, either in a vocational position or professional position in ministry, then you have a weekly schedule, you have a regimen and a routine, and you have responsibilities that are on a schedule to maintain. And so it's easy to see that is, in effect, what your agenda is, that you're not winging it at any point. And certainly, hopefully, you're not winging it when you get up to preach or to lead music, that you're prepared and ready to do that. But for most believers that aren't on that sort of a spiritual schedule, then much of the time, it does look like they're winging it. Unfortunately, I think a lot of those believers are winging it to the wrong place, but that's another story. So the first thing it looks like winging it. And right now, I know that I think it's safe to say that my schedule, my routine, my life at this point in time, that's essentially what I'm doing. I'm winging it within the broad parameters of God's will and purpose that I want to continue to be a part of until I simply can't any longer. The second thing that spiritual winging it looks like is what is resistance. It looks like resistance. Let's pick up our reading in verse 9. Much time had been lost, and because navigation had become dangerous and the day of fasting had already passed, Paul began to warn those on the ship. Now pause. The day of fasting this is for the Day of Atonement, which gives us a window of time when this event took place. It's somewhere between September the 24th and October the 1st on our calendar. And so in that time, and so that means it's leading into the fall of the year, and we know that weather cycles are predicated on what time of the year that it is, what the weather's going to be like, how good, how calm, how bad, how rough. All those variables are dictated by the time that the events take place. And so Paul is essentially articulating that. Verse 10, Men, I see that during this voyage there will be hardship and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion was persuaded by the pilot and the owner of the ship, and not by what Paul said. Pause. I like the fact that it looks like resistance is going on here. The ship is on a course. The weather's not looking good. They're in that season where the weather does not get better. It gets worse leading into winter, and the prime sailing doesn't happen then until the spring of the following year. And Paul, now he's not a ship owner. He's not a ship captain, but he has spent more than his time on board ships whenever, wherever, however. And a lot of times those were not good experiences. And because of where he had been, what he had done, it's like he waved a flag to them. He says, I know that you think I'm nobody because I'm just a preacher and I'm a prisoner. But let me tell you what I think. It actually looks like Paul is offering some resistance to the status quo. So while it looks like acceptance, it can also look like resistance in the moment. He's just simply speaking his mind. Verse 12, it says, since the harbor was not a good place to spend the winter, most of the men favored putting out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix and spend the winter there. It is a Cretan harbor that faces southwest and northwest. When a gentle breeze began to blow from the south, they thought they could make it to Phoenix. So they hoisted anchor and began sailing along the shore of Crete. Pause one more time. Paul said, I don't think this is a good idea. Been here, done that. And they said, no, we have a destination to get to. We have a cargo to get to its places. We're willing to risk it. And after all, this place that we're staying is not good because of the direction that it faces. Now, many of you know that my wife and I, we spent some time living on board a big boat while we were in Baltimore, trying to figure out what God was doing next. And we kept a boat down toward the inner harbor, and then later out in a marina in Pasadena. And what we learned was that in certain times of the year, when the wind came out of the northwest and it came off the shore, it actually accelerated coming across the water. And man, you could take a beating. Now, it wasn't a sailboat. We weren't trying to go anywhere. We were just trying to live our lives. But you talk about taking a beating. So I understood something of the sailor's position, that wasn't the best harbor to sail in. But I also understood the other, that may have been better than nothing. And so anyway, we resume our story here. When a gentle breeze began to blow, verse 13 again, from the south, they thought they could make it to Phoenix. I think that surely they would know in this season of the year that quite often this is the calm before the storm, but they ignore that. But it was not long, verse 14, it was not long before a violent wind called a northeaster. Now, if you're from the northeast of the United States, it's called a nor'easter. Swept down from the island. The ship was caught so that it couldn't face the wind, and we gave up and were swept along. As we drifted to the shelter side of a small island called Cauda, we barely managed to secure the ship's lifeboat. The ship's crew pulled it up on deck and used ropes to brace the ship, fearing that they would hit the large sandbank near Libya. They lowered the sail and drifted along. The next day, because we were tossed so violently by the storm, they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's equipment overboard with their own hands. For a number of days, neither the sun nor stars were to be seen, and the storm continued to rage until at last all hope of being saved vanished. So spiritual winging goes from, it looks like an acceptance of circumstances, the who's and the what's and the how's and the why's, to a resistance, speaking your mind about what needs to go on. Speak your mind, but doing so respectfully. I think in his tones and his presentation, Paul was just like, guys, I know that I don't know as much as you do, but I do know this much, and let me just sort of speak what I have to say. And they ignored, when it doesn't have to do with the Bible. Quite often in the past at churches I've served in, when there were other issues in life that I spoke into, I got that quizzical look from either deacons or trustees. It was like, what can you possibly know? You're just a preacher. Well, in time they found out that I did know a few more things. And so Paul, I want to think that when they ignored him, they went ahead and went about their course, and they ran afoul of the weather. I'm sure Paul could be seen at times, whether he was in shackles or not, somewhere on deck going, He didn't have to say a word. He just knew that his position had been substantiated by the events and the circumstances that they were facing. So sometimes spiritual winging can look like a pushback in the context of life that doesn't have to do with church or missionary work or singing or sharing the gospel. It could just look like being a person who has something to say in context. The third thing that a spiritual winging can look like is it can look like confidence, which is sort of a strange thing. You're a prisoner. Others are making all the decisions for you. They're not giving you a vote or a voice in the circumstances. And so how can there be an appearance of confidence in this spiritual winging? Let's pick up our reading in verse 21. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood among his shipmates and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete. You would have avoided this hardship and damage." You have to decide for yourself whether Paul should have said that or not. I'm entertained, I'm humored by that which many are not. The fact that Paul didn't stop being human simply because he became a vessel to be used of God for the sake of the kingdom, to preach and to teach and to plant churches and to be used of God to perform miracles. So in this life circumstances, when you're operating simply within these broad strokes of being obedient to God's will, and you're a set of circumstances that don't intrinsically have a spiritual value, and when you have spoken in resistance to a context and it's played out the way you suggested and nobody's wanted to admit that, when you have your opportunity to stand up and go, told you so, I leave it to you to whether you think it was the right thing to do. Resume our reading. Paul says, "You would have avoided this hardship and damage if you had listened to what I had said. But now I urge you to have courage, because there will be no loss of life among you, but only loss of the ship. For just last night, an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood by me and said, 'Stop being afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor. Indeed, God has given you the lives of everyone who is sailing with you.'" I find it interesting in this moment when he exudes this confidence, when he's telling these people, it's going to be okay. Everybody's going to survive. The ship will be lost. That when he recounts, he's honest enough that he confesses to what? His own anxiety. The fact that they didn't do what he said that would put them at risk didn't mean that he didn't believe that the ship could go down. I don't think he had any assumption he's going to be the second Jonah and catch a ride on a fishy submarine. So when the angel appeared, the word to Paul was, "You too, chill out. Stop being afraid." It was So take courage, men, Paul said, because I trust God that it will turn out just as he told me. However, we will have to run aground on some island. It was the 14th night, and we were drifting through the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors suspected that land was near. They could do that simply, the air, the waterfowl, the sounds, their experience would indicate that. After taking soundings, they found the depth to be 25. They take a long piece of string with a weight on it, and that would take a sound. They dropped to see how deep the water was, how many fathoms it was. A little later, they took soundings again and found it was 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and began praying for daylight to come. Meanwhile, the sailors had begun trying to escape from the ship. They lowered the lifeboat into the sea and pretended that they were going to lay out the anchors from the bow. Paul told the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men remain aboard, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and set it adrift. Right up to daybreak, Paul kept urging all of them to eat something. He said, "Today is the 14th day that you have been waiting and going without food, not eating anything. So I urge you to eat something, for it will help you survive, since none of you will lose so much as a hair from his head." After he said this, he took some bread, thanked God in front of everyone, broke it, and began to eat. Everyone was encouraged and had something to eat. There were 276 of us on the ship. And after they had eaten all they wanted, they began lightening the ship by dumping its cargo of wheat into the sea. So, spiritual winging, it can look like acceptance or acquiescence of the circumstance. It can look like resistance, speaking against, speaking your mind, having your say in a context where you really don't have any right to, you're just simply asserting an opportunity to. And then it can look like confidence, and confidence in the strangest set of circumstances when everything has gone south, it's gone bad, it doesn't look good at all for Paul to stand up and say, "Told you so, but it's going to be okay because an angel appeared to me and said, chill out, start being afraid, Paul. You're not going to lose anybody, not even a hair on their head, but you are going to run aground and you're going to lose the ship." And it said while some of those had attempted to put the lifeboat back over because they thought they'd slip into the lifeboat and sail away from the sinking ship and get to shore, Paul had a further word. He says, listen, you do that, all bets are off. Your warranty expires in terms of God's promises to you. Now, you have to decide what you make out of the fact that Paul's speaking into this context in this moment as a prisoner. And as someone who spoke when he wasn't invited to speak about their sailing plans. He was the one that spoke and said, "I told you so," when it went bad. And now he continues to encourage them because he's exuding a confidence in their context that perhaps surprised them. And they listened to what he had to say. Sometimes confidence will do that. So what does spiritual winging look like? It can look like confidence in the strangest time and circumstance. Angelic reassurance and instructions about what to do. Maybe there's a footnote in here somewhere that says, even when we don't have a clearly defined mandate in the moment or the next, we just know that we're between those places. We're operating with sort of broad stroke mandates spiritually in terms of kingdom work, that we can still get a word from God that's detailed enough to tell us what to do and what not to do, even though there are things that are yet undefined and unrevealed. And then the last thing that it can look like is it can look like affirmation. It can look like affirmation. Let's finish our reading, verse 39. When day came, they didn't recognize the land, but they could see a bay with a beach on it, which they planned to run the ship ashore if possible. So they cut the anchors free and left them in the sea. At the same time, they untied the ropes and held the steering oars, raised the foresail to the wind, and headed for the beach. But they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow stuck and couldn't be moved, and while the stern was broken to pieces by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners to keep them from swimming ashore and escaping. But the centurion wanted to save Saul, so he prevented them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest were to follow, some on planks and others on various pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone got to the shore safely. Sometimes it can look like acceptance. Sometimes it can look like resistance. Sometimes it can look like confidence. And then sometimes it can simply look like affirmation. That when everything had been said and done, it unfolded as Paul said. A centurion kept him alive when he didn't have to, all by the providence of God. The disposition evidently of the centurion was a positive disposition because of everything that had happened. But there was this affirmation. There was this affirmation to Paul, whether anybody else with them recognized that or acknowledged that or not, because for them, they're reading the tea leaves. They're speculating, they're guessing about what it all means and whether he really knows what he's talking about, and is he really representative of the God of the universe? All of those things that at the end of the day, there was an affirmation that God was at work in his life to keep him alive and to get him to his destination. So we're going to come back full circle as we wind this thing down and what a spiritual winging it looks like. If you recall back in Acts chapter 20, before Paul has made his way to Jerusalem that got him in this position that he's in now, he's wrapping up a third missionary journey. And he's saying to the believers in Ephesus, if you recall, as he's making his way back to Jerusalem, to the believers in Ephesus, he said in Acts chapter 20, verses 22 and following, he says, "And now compelled by the Spirit, I am on my way to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there, except that in town after town, the Holy Spirit assures me that imprisonment and suffering are waiting for me. But I don't place any value on my life. If only I can finish my race and the ministry that I received from the Lord Jesus of testifying to the gospel of God's grace." Maybe the question is not what does spiritual winging it look like, but what should spiritual winging look like in any of our lives? It should look like we're still on assignment. We're still on mission. We're still on purpose. Even when we're doing those other routines in life that don't have an intrinsic spiritual value, that we never drop our guard. We never lay aside the armor of God, any part of it, as a part of the journey, so that at a heartbeat's notice, we're prepared to do what God would have us to do. Because we are marching on those orders for Him to advance His kingdom, to make Christ known, to disciple those who believe, to live in holiness and sanctification, to be a reflection of Jesus at all time and under all circumstances, regardless of what we see that looking like in the road ahead. I hope this can be a word of encouragement to you, to know that you should always be on assignment, regardless of what you know what that assignment specifically is going to be. Let me lead us in prayer. Father, I commit this journey to you as I commit myself to you and these friends who join us for a word, whether it's an individual that's simply looking to further their walk with you, or somebody that still has not landed in a local fellowship to worship with other believers, or whether somebody in a church that's struggling and wondering what's next, because there can be that church that is in that place. They don't have a pastor, they don't have a spiritual leader, and they're floundering around for what's next, and realizing that they're in that place too of spiritual winging it. Knowing that you still have a purpose and a plan and a will for them to fulfill in that season, to get them to the destination that you have designed for them, provided they walk in obedience to you the whole way. Thank you for your love for us that makes it possible, and for the privilege of knowing and serving you. It's in Jesus' name we pray, and for His sake. Amen. Thank you for tuning in. Please let me know if the change is a benefit, if it helps, if I need to go back and fix it and do something else. Let me hear from you. If you've got questions, please communicate with me. If you have prayer concerns, let me know, and we'll be in prayer with you. And then invite others to share the journey as this continues to expand, and others continue to log on and discover Church Rebirth Ministries. And hopefully God will continue to use us. And thank you for those that have been supporting the ministry. Many of you see that button on Facebook and have responded to that. We're grateful for that. For those that are faithfully doing it on a regular basis. If you're one of the old school people, I know a lot of you, and you'd just like to drop a check in the mail, you can make it out to Church Rebirth Ministries and send it to this mailing address. But anytime, God bless you. Hopefully your ship won't end up on the rocks, and you'll have the joy of arriving at the destination that God has for you to serve Him there. God bless you.